Hello, hello. Hello and welcome to the London Satellite of the Understanding Risk Global Forum 2022. I'm Georgina Godwin and I'll be your host for this very stimulating day here at the Design Museum, and it's a very appropriate venue for this event. It prompts us to think about how risk is factored into design, and that's something that we're going to invite you to consider later on today. As part of the larger Understanding Risk Global Forum, we'll be joined by a large online audience, and both those in the room, that's you, and on the internet will have opportunities to ask questions during the day. There'll also be some interactive elements, and so for that reason, and so that you can tweet, if people do still tweet, I'm not sure any longer, but we're asking you to keep your phone on, but do put it on silent now if you would. The hashtag is UR22, and you could specify that this is the London Satellite Hub. You can also use the location-specific hashtag UR22LDN. In the case of fire or any other emergencies, there are fully trained fire marshals here, and they'll guide you to the exits and the meeting point. We don't anticipate anything like that happening. Morning break, lunch and afternoon break will be served in the Huth Gallery. That's upstairs on level 2. Now, we are running a very tight schedule, so we'll need you to get up and down very efficiently with the help of our event staff in order to return to the auditorium in time for the next session. So you should sort of think of me as a bit like a kind of head prefect or maybe a sheepdog or something. So I'll be handing out detentions or perhaps the odd nip if you don't keep to time. The London Satellite Hub has been organised by Lloyd's Register Foundation in partnership with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre and Anticipation Hub. But we're also very grateful for the support of a number of other partners, including Sense About Science, the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk, and the British Red Cross. So, to open the day, we're delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, who is Richard Blewitt, Executive Director of International British Red Cross. Richard has devoted 3 decades to international humanitarian and development work across the United Nations and various NGOs. He'll share some of his experience in understanding compound risk, his time spent in Somalia, and some solutions the Red Cross have devised to help people deal with risk. Richard.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to start, I rejoined the Red Cross 3 years ago because of my fear and concern about the climate crisis and the relevance of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement to doing something practical and influential on that agenda. So I want to start by sort of addressing the question of what does risk mean to me and resilience. So my first major professional exposure to risk was with the Ethiopian government and Save the Children through the lens of a program called the Nutrition Surveillance Program. It ran from 1986 to 2002, 17 years. At that time, there was major trust issues with the Ethiopian government for many countries in the West. And there needed to be evidence-based data to inform decision-makings around response. So Save the Children partnered the Ethiopian government to essentially weigh and measure children all over Ethiopia and provide that data. And it worked. It enabled some level of effective response to the different crises Ethiopia had over those 17 years. Eventually, it was closed down because it was too expensive, or thought to be too expensive, and it wasn't fully embedded in the Ethiopian government. And, yet risk remains in Ethiopia. It's a different risk, but actually we're facing a major food crisis at the moment in Ethiopia, partly linked to the conflict in Tigray and partly linked to just endemic food insecurity in the country and levels of poverty and the climate crisis. So, of course, I'm a cyclist. I cycled here today from the Essex Road up in Islington. And there's a risk in cycling in London, isn't there? I don't know how many people cycle in London. Okay, there's my fellow cyclists. I used to cycle 20 years ago, and the risk was worse. There's definitely more places to cycle a bit safer. And of course, as I've got older, I've just chosen a very bright helmet to give me some level of security. I didn't have that in my 20s. So, you know, risk is a personal thing, and I think we all experience risk, although I'm a humanitarian and development professional, in COVID. In those moments when we all feared what was going on in all of our countries around the world, we lived with risk personally. And I think that we should think about that in the context of professionally how we view risk. So I've seen lots of changing stories around risk, and the first one I'm going to start with is Somalia and Somaliland. So in September, I visited Somaliland. I'd last been there in 1994, which is quite a long time ago. Many elements of risk were very different, but some of them were enduring. So what was different? Well, in 1994, Somaliland had experienced conflict, there was a very weak state, there was somewhat a predatory private sector, and then you come forward to 2022, you know, this year. There's peace in Somaliland, which is in the north of Somalia. There is a state functioning, although it's not internationally recognized. There's a private sector that works very well, and there's quite strong urbanization. But at the same time, there is increased vulnerability for agro-pastoralists who live in Somaliland. As a result of 4 years of drought, they're as vulnerable as they were back in 1994, but the factors that are creating vulnerability for them are changing. What about some of the similarities in Somaliland? Well, there's remittances. Remittances are a remarkable part of survival in Somalia. There's the clan structures. The clan structures, you look after your clan. Those have been very resilient over the last 25 years. The humanitarian system is there, helping. You know, there are great limits to it, and sometimes it's late, but it is there. And the other thing that hasn't changed is the lifestyle of the agro-pastoralists themselves, the people who look after cattle and sheep and camels. It kind of has remained quite consistent, even though the risks they face have got more difficult. So I just wanted to share a personal example. Stepping back and looking at the global picture, we have a growing humanitarian landscape. You know, there are compounding risks associated with climate, conflict, COVID, and cost of living. Overall, governments and citizens seem to have much less time to actually factor in and do recovery. How can we cope in living in an era of compounding risk? I personally find this very complicated and challenging. I think your expertise here, I'm sure, and discussions today will help, you know, navigate continuous improvement in that agenda. On the humanitarian agenda and humanitarian response, over the last 10 years, we've seen a 400% increase in the funding for humanitarian work. So there's a lot of money flowing, but we still can't cope. We haven't got enough money in Yemen, we haven't got enough money in the Horn of Africa food crisis, we haven't got enough money in Central African Republic, and so huge gaps are still there. So clearly the humanitarian enterprise is not really the answer. We need much more systemic answers. You know, COP27, you know, in Egypt is another good step forward. Particularly with regard to the establishment of the damage and loss provision. But of course, it's a contested agenda. Will money really flow? Who will get the money? How will it flow? Many issues that are going to have to be addressed. And then, of course, sadly, on COP27, not enough is being done on mitigation. So we can only foresee a worsening of the humanitarian landscape and the effects on climate in years to come. As I look at the world through a risk lens, I want to highlight 12 areas where I think we're making progress, and you may disagree or agree. The first is anticipation and early response. This ends up saving lives and money. You know, we were not good at that as humanitarians. We were tended to be responding, but actually development actors and humanitarian actors have got into anticipation and early action in a better way. The second is safety nets. And ensuring safety nets and agile social protection schemes linked can actually save lives and save money. The third area where I think there's an increase over the last 20, 30 years is high-performing early warning schemes linked to community action. If those work well, they save lives. If they don't work well, unfortunately, they don't. The fourth area that I would highlight that's obviously very critical, where there's some progress, but challenge as well, is the question of national political will. You know, as it's absolutely critical to make sure that mitigation, risk mitigation plans and processes are properly in play and multi-stakeholder ownership. The fifth area I'd highlight is localization. You know, a lot of our humanitarian system is driven from the north, driven from the west, driven by self-interest. And actually, national actors need to solve these problems in their own political economies, governments and civic action, private sector. So localization is a positive trend in our sector and in the aid sector. Listening and partnering communities is another area where I think we're getting a bit better. But if we don't do that, we end up doing the wrong prescriptions with the wrong programming that doesn't create durable and sustainable results. I think we're making progress on data and models of risk, which are obviously critical to addressing better the risk factors that are faced in communities and in countries. I think humanitarians are starting to be a bit more risk conscious. They're kind of being made aware of what risk means, and how to sort of factor risk into our processes. There's been, on number 9, there's been more work around urban risk. Historically, our sector was very rural focused, and actually urban risk is a huge factor that we've got to think about much more agilely and be engaged with. Number 10, I think there's much more work on public and private sector partnerships around risk, which is a really positive step forward. There's a deepening, number 11, of understanding of linking climate, humanitarian, and development interfaces. We all work in our own little bubbles, but actually we've got to work together if we're going to find proper answers to these challenges, including in the area of really investing in adaptation. You know, still far, far too little money reaches, the inadequate amount of money put into adaptation reaches at-risk communities living in difficult circumstances. 12, I think we've made big progress on resilience. Understanding resilience, owning the term. It's got a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people. Some people say it takes the politics out of risk, but at the same time, I think building resilience is going to be critical in the next 10, 20 years, and how we view humanitarian work, development work going forwards. And then informed by all of that are the Sustainable Development Goals. It is amazing that, you know, 4, 5, 6 years ago, governments around the world with civic action came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. They're the best thing we've got to try and save our planet and help inform better policy making in the countries where we work. But I think COVID, the conflict in Ukraine is knocking us off target. And we're going to have to go back to the SDGs because there's not much better on the table to find consensus about working together and addressing crises. But where are we struggling? Well, I'd highlight 4 areas where we struggle, at least from my perspective, in this arena. The first is on fragile countries, from Niger to Central African Republic to Yemen to Syria. You know, the risk models and our tools to get on the front foot are just insufficient. We just don't have the ways to deal with these problems, and we can't leave 25 fragile countries behind because all of that fragility is terrible for the people who suffer it, but it's also going to have consequences for the rest of the world in terms of security and safety and other issues. We have to get better, secondly, at factoring in risk and risk concern networks. You know, they're definitely getting stronger, you know, in the way we're operating, but actually on the ground we're not scaling initiatives to solve the problem. So the scale of initiatives on the ground is insufficient. Lots of pilots, lots of energy from some governments like the Germans, but not enough scale to really get on top of the issue. The third area that I think we struggle with is joined up government. You know, multidisciplinary, multi-sector approaches. You know, it's easy to say it and roll it off the tongue, but actually ministries work in silos, agencies work in silos. It's not easy to actually get joined up policy making that's risk informed in reality. And then lastly, you know, I would highlight the issue of the trust in institutions is another factor that affects the risk landscape. You know, in 2008, I was asked by the UK government to go to Myanmar, and I led the assessment for Cyclone Nargis. 120,000 people had died in Cyclone Nargis because the government in Myanmar didn't issue any early warning system. Now, they hadn't had a cyclone for 100 years. So a combination of no cyclones plus a government that anyhow didn't have a close link to the communities that it was there to supposedly govern over, you know, led to the crisis happening. But what I witnessed in the assessment was that it was possible to tell the story. The local civic actors, joined the UN, ASEAN, the government of Myanmar itself to tell the story of what the problem was in the Delta and what we needed to do to provide durable solutions. But at the same time, each agency has its own answer to what the solutions are. So the World Food Programme will say it's food. UNICEF will say it's children. And so we still have a problem in our sector around a principle-based analysis of a problem that tells the story from the perspective of the communities we're there to serve. So anyhow, on the back of Cyclone Nargis, I helped set up an institution that's based in Geneva called ACAPS, which does independent assessment of humanitarian crises, because we almost can't trust ourselves, which is not really a very good statement of our sector, because we come with our prescribed answers that don't really find results. Okay, so I want to now turn to what about some good risk-informed work that's going on at the global level? And there's lots of it. I mean, you all know that, you're all part of it. I was very proud in New York in 2019 at the Climate Summit to help launch the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, the REAP. I would urge you to look it up and have a look at what they do. It's a network of humanitarian, development, climate, and environmental agencies looking at risk. And the idea is, how do you make 1 billion people better safe from crises by 2025? It's an ambitious idea. Governments are part of it, civic society, academics, and others. Another initiative, obviously, that's been quite long-term is the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery that continues to do very good work. At the COP27, there was a launch of the Global Shield against climate risk. It'll be very interesting to understand how that's going to work, but it presents another opportunity. Ensure Resilience Global Partnership has been going a number of years, supported out of Germany. There's the Adaptation Action Coalition, the Anticipation Hub, which is part of our Red Cross family. There's the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the list goes on, and I'm sure many of you have other institutions that you're connecting to. That's a great ecosystem to be part of. I feel despite the momentum and the good news, however, the challenge is still to bring this to the ground at scale, where national ownership and political will are absolutely essential. Obviously, data is really critical to help bring things to the ground and make sure that we are doing things in a way that's going to provide durable, sustainable solutions. And I think the World Risk Report poll is critical for risk practitioners. This is a very exciting day here today in London. I think it's a chance for a deep dive into how the climate crisis is changing the risk landscape. And also how systems thinkings on economics can help us tackle systemic risk. You've got a fantastic speakers this afternoon coming to talk about those questions, because we're going to have to think differently. Our models are not sufficient and they're not working if we're going to get on top of the challenges we face. So I would urge you all today to meet at least 10 colleagues here, maybe 15. Have fun, innovate, build collaborations, and continue to do the work you really do well, which is deepening work on risk in years to come. I've already met 3, and I'm very happy to have done so. I'm sure that you will definitely outperform me today as you get to network with each other to sort of find ways of building something to move forward. So thank you very much.